Hi, friends. It's Laura. The episode you're about to hear was so much fun, and we're so excited that we were able to talk with Fonda Lee. However, if you have not read the Greenbone saga, you may want to stop listening because this episode is spoiler filled. Enjoy!
Welcome to our pod, and by that I mean on Wednesdays we read. I'm Hannah.
I'm Laura.
And we are usually two best friends who do a deep dive into a new book series, one book at a time. But as you all know, we just got done.
Three best friends.
We're three best friends, and we just finished peeking into the Greenbone saga, our season 4 series. And we have on the pod with us today, Fonda Lee. Fonda Lee, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
We're so excited to have you. As everyone knows, we had you on to discuss your novella that came out earlier this year. And then we asked you on the pod if you wanted to come back after we covered your next 3 books. So we've read a lot more of your work and we're a huge fan.
And really, Fonda is here today to answer for all of her crimes that she's committed against the No Peak and Mountain clans. That's why we're really here.
Just to make
it's going to be a long episode.
It's going to be a lot of tense moments for Laura. We honestly can't sing the praises of these books enough. If you guys want to listen to that, you can listen to our last episode where we did a wrap up of the series. But Fonda, we just want to hear more from you and what was your process for these novels, building the different character arcs, plotting out the years and years that went into these, the plot and the characters. Just what was your own process with them?
Oh, goodness. I don't even know where to begin. I now look back on the whole thing with a sense of awe that I even survived it. It's kind of, in my mind, likening it to looking back on a marathon that you ran or giving birth. Being I survived. I don't know how exactly, but it all came together in the end. I look back on when I first wrote Jade City. I wrote that on spec, not knowing whether or not it would sell, and not knowing whether or not it would sell as a series. So I wrote it very much as a passion project, knowing that this was the book that I wanted to read because I couldn't find it on shelves for myself. So if nothing else, it was going to be something that would satisfy me. And then when it sold to Orbit in a 3-book deal, then I sat down and said, okay, great. Now I have this much bigger canvas that I can work with. And at that point, I had a very rough idea of the trilogy and the 3 installments. I gave myself what I call a fence and a scaffold. And I talk about this when I teach classes about writing series. By a fence, I meant I had to think about, okay, what is this book not? And that helped me rein in the possibility of scope creep. And what I landed on with that was that this was, even though it has the bones of an epic fantasy, at its core, it's about the Cull family. And that had to be the big through line that ran through all 3 books. So if I was ever going too far away from that, if I had side characters in other countries and subplots all over the place and the sorts of things that epic fantasy are prone to, which is growing the story bigger and bigger, I always had to exert the self-discipline to bring it back and be how does this fundamentally impact the family? So that was the fence that I gave myself. And then the scaffold was, I knew that the first book was about the beginning of this clan war and very much focused on Kacon and the city of Janloon, and the tensions between the clans. And the second book would expand that and turn it into an international story. And that the third book would expand it in time and turn it into an intergenerational story. So that's how I thought about those 3, because I wanted each of these 3 installments to have their own identity, even though they all come together in one big story. In my mind, the best trilogies are the ones where each episode, each book has its own arc and its own identity. So that's kind of how I thought about it in broad strokes. And then in the actual process of writing it was it was very long, but it also happened, Jade Legacy in particular, happened during the pandemic. So that final book was my pandemic book. And I remember writing that, thinking to myself, no matter what happens, I am not leaving this earth with an unfinished trilogy. I was very driven to get that, to stick the landing on the trilogy. And I had such a large cast of characters and so many plot threads that at times it felt like I was, I don't know, juggling plates. And one thread, if it was pulled, would unravel 5 other threads. And I was, just sometimes at the bursting point of my brain's capacity to hold things together. But the only way to actually write it was very much like eating the elephant, one bite at a time. I broke the story down into smaller and more manageable chunks so that when I was in the process of writing it, I didn't have to hold the entire thing in my brain. Jade Legacy in particular, you can see is sort of divided into eras. And I started to think of them very much like seasons of a television show, and where the natural breaks were, and in the narrative, there's a skip forward in time. So I engineered that so that they're sort of natural chunks, and that actually also mirrored my writing process. I would think of this chunk almost as a novel or a novella on its own, and then in the end it all had to be stitched together.
We definitely said that like this is one of the first trilogies we've ever read where we're like, nope, we could have had 7 books of this and been incredibly happy. Like
I did love too, like with the way that time was presented in Jade Legacy, how it said like 17 years after he became the pillar. I just thought it was like really poetic to list it that way, because it kind of like brings the reader back into the like reality of it all. Like, oh my gosh, we've been reading about 17 years of time. And you sit with the characters a little more when you're like, wow, they've been going through so much. And I was kind of wondering, because you've written these characters throughout different time periods in their lives, was it hard for you to write them as they're changing as characters, like via time jump? Because obviously we start with Hilo. He's not the same person in Jade City that he is in Jade War or that he is in Jade Legacy. So I was wondering if it was difficult to kind of progress with the characters.
Strangely, no. And I think it was just because I knew the characters so well that it felt like I was just living with them for an extended period of time. And it felt natural to sort of see them progress through stages in their life. And, I don't think, I've said this before, I don't think that this is a book I could have written 20 or 10 years, even 10 or even 5 years ago, honestly, because, I'm now at a point in my life where I have kids who are older and aging parents. And, I've been through enough of my life that I felt like I had the chops to be able to write this family over an extended period of time. And I think the thing that I tried to keep in mind, developing each of these characters over their lives, was that that we as people change and evolve, but there's always the core of us that's fundamentally the same. So, Hilo he's different in Jade Legacy. He's older, he's seasoned, he's seen a lot, but he's still himself. And, I liked just seeing these characters' relationships grow and evolve and get more nuanced, because I could spend so much more time with them. And I had the luxury of having a multiple POV story where every character is viewing the other characters. And so you see them through the lens of their family members.
So true. Like, this is such a good story for family and everything. But like, my next question is just a little bit more down in the depths of like, what made you choose Jade as like a piece that augmented people's abilities? And like, how did you use it when you were building the world system overall? Because it's such a unique way to show like a quote unquote magic system.
Yeah, I love the idea of magic as being somewhat of a mundane commodity. And I've heard my work described as low magic, which I think has been used in different ways. But for me, it sort of means that it's not something that's unknowable and beyond the capacity of humans to harness. And it's magic that feels like it's just another part of the world, the same way that like cell phones are kind of magic. Like, I don't know how they work. They're magic to me, but they do. And they're just a part of daily life. And that's sort of what I wanted the Greenbone saga to have, was this sense of groundedness and realism that would make you feel like this was a real place, and that the Jade in this world was to them just another part of their lives. And the reason why I chose Jade was very much because I had always watched martial arts flicks and kung fu movies where the characters in them are able to like perform all these feats that like normal human beings could never do, even with decades of training. And as a martial artist, it always made me kind of resentful, because I was like, I have been training a long time. I cannot jump over walls. This is very annoying. And so I figured there has to be like something that would explain this. And, in epic fantasy, there's so many like magic weapons, magic crystals, and diamonds, and so on. But because I was setting this in an Eastern-inspired cultural milieu, jade was the natural pick. It's the substance has historically been considered the most valuable, more valuable than gold, more valuable than diamonds, and it's always had this sort of spiritual significance to it. So it made sense for me to just make it like literally magical.
A follow-up question on that, though. Did you ever figure out how to jump over walls or anything? Or?
I have acquired a considerably large amount of jade items over the course of writing this trilogy. Either people gift it to me and they're like, this is a perfect gift for Fonda, or I'll find a piece and I'm like, okay, well, this will be great for me to wear to a book event. And no, despite the number of jade pieces I put on, I guess I'm a stone eye.
You're a stone eye.
Yeah, that's like the perfect. I always remember being like, oh no, Hogwarts has to be real. I'm just a muggle. Like, right. Jade has to work. You're just a stone eye. It's totally fine.
So Fonda, all of the characters in the Greenbone saga are so complicated and deep, and you can always or almost always understand the choices or actions that they're making, even if you disagree with them. And it seems like you kind of like to write characters that are a little bit morally gray. Is that something you kind of lean into and enjoy?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's pretty consistent across a large amount of my work, is the fact that I don't really write heroes and villains. I try to just write people. And I like the fact that I could, if I had oodles and oodles of time and inclination, rewrite the entire Greenbone saga from the Mountain's point of view and make you believe that they're the protagonists, and are equally sympathetic to the Call family. And I just like that nuance. The reality is that our world is complicated and there's lots of moral gray in our world, and it was all part of trying to make the story and the themes in it, the characters in it, feel authentic.
One of the pieces that like I always come back to when it comes to like how well you just write people are the I and Shay like showdowns in each of the books, like pretty much. Because in the first one, it's this scary moment where like I almost feels Machiavellian and how she like moves all the different pieces around. And in the second book, Shay's kind of like, what are you doing here? Like, we both make mistakes. I don't understand why we keep having these meetings. And I was like, yeah, I feel myself wondering the same thing about where like you see her way more flawed in the second book than you ever did in the first book, where they were just like much younger, so they didn't quite understand her as much.
Yeah, and it was interesting to write Ite in particular because she's not a POV character. And I still had that challenge of making her feel like this constant presence in the book, even in the chapters where she's not there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too how she like we've said multiple times when we've been covering the book, like in different sections, we're like, yeah, she makes a good point. I mean, we should maybe listen to her. She's kind of making a good point, but then at the same time, no, she's still bad. She's still bad, even though she made a good point. We're not gonna go there. But it's interesting to see her progress into a character that becomes less legendary as we go along, because she becomes more human.
Right.
And the thing about like, I find this part of this book fascinating. It's just like the way you use different like monetary structures and like foreign belief systems and like economics and politics, like just all mixed in together to build like a very magic system in a very real world location. So like the answer is probably very much, but like how helpful it was your background in economics, and how fun was it for you to kind of like geek out on the more like foreign national parts of the world building in this book and these books?
Super fun. I mean, you're right, my background in business absolutely does seep in there. There's definitely influence where, for me, a fantasy world doesn't feel entirely complete until I've sort of thought through how it works from like an economic standpoint. And so when you combine that with the idea that I mentioned earlier of making Jade this ordinary commodity, even though it's this really valuable resource, of course, it would be part of the national economy. It would be it would be part of people's belief systems and religion. There would be cartel set up to control its distribution. There would be all these things, and that part is just, for me, the fun of world building, is sort of thinking about those next order ideas, like, oh, I have this cool speculative fiction idea, okay, now let's like see how it ripples through everything and opens all these doors to introduce other cool narrative tidbits.
As someone who always struggles when reading world building, where I'm like, why do I care about this? I've cared so much about the political structure, and I'm like, whose idea is this, and what's their planning? Like, it's very interesting.
It can be tricky with writing world building into a story without it feeling like it's a detraction. So the things like the political structure and the economics of the place, like that all only matters to the reader if it matters to the characters. Yeah. So if it's really important to Shay because she has to go into this meeting and convince someone to do X and X, Y, whatever this is, otherwise her clan is in deep trouble, that's when that material is interesting to the reader, is if it's really important to the character.
Well, we've said too, like, we were talking specifically about like the action scenes, but we were saying your writing is so accessible that you are able to get right in the middle of it and understand what's happening and know, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what's going on in this business. This is what's going on in this country. I understand how they feel about this. So it's just really written in such a way that readers can feel involved and not like have an out-of-body experience where they're like, I'm not sure what's going on here, but I'll just skip ahead until there's some more talking. So you did a really great job with that.
Thank you.
You're gonna get a lot of compliments throughout this.
First of many.
I'm fine with it.
Okay.
My question, going a little bit darker, I guess, there's so many like really intense and tragic and difficult to read things that happen in this series, and I was wondering if there were any that were really hard for you to write, or maybe you had fun writing them.
No, they were hard. I don't think that you can expect real emotion or tears out of a reader until you've felt them yourself as a writer. Mm-hmm. So there were scenes where I like dreaded writing them. I knew they had to happen, but they were tough. And like even I'm revising them over and over again and proofreading them. I mean, I still remember going through proof pages where I'm looking for like the tiniest typos, but I'm in this like brutal scene and I'm having to read it over and over again. It was a little bit grueling, but they're hard, but they're also satisfying as a writer, because they are such important narrative pivot points, and the characters are going through it all in that moment. So all the work that you've done as a writer kind of pays off in those big moments, because hopefully you have made the readers come along with you on a journey with these characters and they're feeling it in that moment. So yeah, it's kind of I don't know, it's a pleasurable pain. It's very masochistic.
Can you let us know, like, what was one, if you can remember, what was one scene that really hit you hard that you weren't expecting?
Oh, that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
Make Tar's fate.
Sobbed.
Neither were we, honestly.
I sobbed. I don't know how I got so attached to that character so quickly.
We said, I think I started the episode where we covered that section, and I was like, I didn't know Fonda Lee could make me care about Mike Tar, but here we are.
I had already read ahead the previous episode, and Hannah hadn't read to that part, and it was killing me to not reveal that to her. I'm like, just wait, Hannah, it's going to get really bad. It's going to get really bad. Oh, that was devastating. I think other thing, though, that was like really hard to read, and then when it came up every other time, was the situation with Nico being brought back to the Call family. And even when Nico confronts Hilo about the situation, Hilo just seems so justified in his actions, and you're like, no, you're not handling this right. This is a young boy. You just gave him a donut. And we're like, it's fine. We're going through it. And as a reader, you're just like, no, please go to therapy. You need to go.
Well, there are multiple characters who could have used therapy at some point in that book.
Well, there's something like I noticed about these books, and you kind of mentioned it, where you wanted each book to be its own thing. And something I truly appreciated in this trilogy is the fact that like each novel feels like it's its own standalone moment in time. And like, can you discuss what it felt like to go through that to make sure each of them stood by themselves, and like why you were drawn to that versus like other trilogies that sometimes like they say like the second book is a filler book to get to the third book, and what your process was for that?
Yeah, I was terrified of the second book. And now, having finished the trilogy, it's the book that I'm most proud of because you're right. The second book often is that book that is least memorable out of a trilogy. And it has this disadvantage because the first book introduces you to everything. The third book has the big climactic moments. And then the second book kind of gets lost in there. And I remember writing the second book, just obsessed with wanting it to stand on its own 2 feet and be a worthy sequel. Because, I've like many other readers have read trilogies where the second book had the so-called sophomore slump or second book syndrome. And I ended up studying sequels really with a great deal of, intention. Just like I would find all my favorite sequels. I'd, rewatched Aliens and Terminator 2 and The Godfather Part 2 and, all the sequels that I thought were really great, to try and dissect why they worked well. The main thing in my mind that makes a second book good is that it doesn't try to replicate the first book, and it's not just waiting for the third book. Oftentimes the second book is a whole bunch of setup. So it's really like the first book sold as one book. The writer, maybe spent years working on it. And then they had a publisher say, great, give us a trilogy. So then they wrote books 2 and 3 almost like one thing. So the second book ends up being kind of the first half of a story that spans books 2 and 3. And I didn't want that. I wanted, like I said, to have this identity for each of the books. And so I think one of the things that I'd advise, like anyone who's listening to this, who's maybe working on a second book right now or is contemplating it, is that you have to have as many big moments in that second book, as many life-changing narrative, big narrative payoff moments in that second book as you do in the first and the third. And there has to be a complete story so that even though there's stuff that happens in the third book, like by the end of the second book, it should feel like you went through everything and you came to a natural closing point. So I think if I was forced to pick, I think Jade War is the one that I feel most fond of because of that. And it has like some big moments in it that I think like probably the biggest action scene, is in there. Some of the most shocking moments are in there. And I think that just comes from an experience I had earlier in my career where I had written the first book in a duology. That was EXO. And then I was writing the sequel, Crossfire. And I was like, oh, great, second book. I wrote the first book, second book will be easier. I've done all the world building, I know the characters. Let's go. And I started working on Crossfire as a NaNoWriMo project, and then trashed about 35,000 words and started again. Because I realized the sequel wasn't working. So I knew how hard sequels were, and I knew that it was very easy to kind of fall into that trap with sequels of them being just sort of continuing the first book but not bringing anything new to the table. And that experience I think was very, very good for me to have before tackling Jade War.
That's awesome. I mean, Jade War was very good. Like there were so many action scenes, and it had my favorite fight scene in it. So,
I mean, I think that one of the things that this series does so beautifully is that the characters have to deal with the consequences of actions, whether or not they're actions that they've taken themselves or other characters' actions. And this is something that doesn't always happen in books. Like sometimes characters can just go do something and nobody has to answer for it. And it's just kind of like, oh, that happened. We're moving on. And I was wondering why you found it like important to make the characters have to respond and deal with these things.
Because otherwise there isn't as much satisfaction narratively. And it also doesn't ring as true. Like we kind of know that, you sort of reap what you sow. And I like also pulling in threads from earlier in the story and creating that narrative resonance when they come back in some way. And with a story that had a big cast of characters and a large amount of time, I could do that. There could be characters that had a seemingly minor role, but then they like show back up and they have a bigger role, and it all kind of comes back together, at the time that or makes sense for them to reappear. And it's kind of fun to like pull those threads together to a tapestry. And also like the characters have to deal with the consequences of their actions, but sometimes in unexpected ways. And that's also what I find fun about creating a engaging plot. It's just, okay, maybe you something happens and oh, this is going to come back. But I love it when readers try to guess how it's going to come back and then they're totally wrong.
I know you are great at that, because you leave these little breadcrumbs and you're like, oh, I think this is going to be important in the future, and then later down the road I'm like, why did I even pay attention to that at all?
This actually does lead into my next question, which is like, you have this huge cast of characters in this world. Was there a character you didn't expect to be so big in the series when you were like leaving that little breadcrumb and then you picked it up and you were like, oh, they're huge, I wasn't expecting this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of secondary characters that took on big roles that I couldn't have anticipated initially, even though I sort of laid out the cast of characters in a way that I knew I'd have potential for a number of them. So like Woon Pappy was like a character who was relatively minor in book one and then became more and more important. And then Lot Jin is like another character who's like relatively minor in book one, and he becomes much, much more significant. And I love some of those characters. I mean, even some of the smaller ones, I would like to, learn more about. I just imagine them having like the whole bunch of stuff going on in their lives that like never really surfaces to the top of the story in the books themselves, but like, I don't know, like Vin the Sniper and like Hame and all these other characters, the Zhuan twins. Like there's a bunch of minor characters, but I'm like, they probably have cool stuff going on too, but we only get to see them for a little bit.
I love how you left breadcrumbs though, because like even Woon's wife was like, I have way more going on in my life than you two, and I'm getting out of here. So I feel like you do have a very good cast of characters when they exist outside of the pages that we're reading.
Absolutely. But getting into one of our main characters, Hilo, I think, is probably one of the most amazing characters and character arcs that I've ever read. And I just became like so attached to him throughout the series. And it seems like from what I've read online, other readers had the exact same experience where they just became attached to him. And I was just wondering what you think it is about Hilo that resonates with readers.
I think it's the fact that he has a big heart. He's very passionate. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He does some very questionable things, but he's always doing them because of his love for his family. And I think that is sort of the core of who he is. And he's kind of just one of those he's one of those guys who no matter what he does, you still understand why. I mean, you have, hopefully, if I've done my job right, you, in those moments, you still understand what was driving him. So that's why I think, that or the Jade nipple piercings, which I know some readers mentioned. It was something I wrote in a relatively throwaway line and did not anticipate that people would glom onto that.
I actually didn't know that people had glommed onto that.
That's a specific thing about Halo that they're like, that's why we love him. It's the nipple piercings.
And I have Googled fan art of these characters, so I'm surprised I didn't see more of that. Well, and there's something that like one of my favorite two of my favorite characters were Wen and Shay. And I think that we get to see a lot of their character and how like they're treated both, in Janloon and KCON and internationally. And there's like a lot of intersectionality going on with those two. And like all these tense moments with them. So like, what was the experience writing those like tense moments for Wen and Shay? Because they went through a lot of things, even together and apart.
Yeah, they did. Wen and Shay, I really enjoyed writing them separately and also together, because one of the things that I wanted to do with this series was to show women in positions of power in different ways. Oftentimes you see like the strong female character in sort of the stereotypical sense of strong, in that she's, I don't know, she's Wonder Woman, or she's like a badass or whatever. But I wanted to have my female characters all feel very distinct in the way that they wielded power in a very male dominated culture of green bone society. And seeing them interact was a lot of fun because they all had kind of their own way of not just surviving, but also exerting themselves and being this really important presence in the clan, but doing it and having very different approaches to it. Like Ait's approach, entirely different from how Wen becomes such an influential figure in her clan. So that was really satisfying for me. And also having them also be, I think, having their family role be very intertwined with their powerful clan roles, right? Like Wen is, yes, she is a powerful, influential figure in the clan, but she's also a mother and a wife. And same with Shay. And I wanted to show them in all those moments of both influence and family intimacy, and the domestic side of their lives as well.
Absolutely. The relationships between the women in this, especially between Shay and Wen, it's so great to see, because most of the time you see women depicted as adversaries, and it's like, people don't always have to fight. Like, we can get along. We're on the same side. We don't have to be against each other. But I think that the comparisons that you see between Shay and Aitmata are really interesting. And I was kind of wondering what you think the main reason that Shay doesn't become her own version of Aitmata is.
That's a really good question. I'd be curious to know the analysis that people make between them, because there's that moment in Jade City where Shay has this crucial choice to make, right? Like Ait also essentially offers to partner up with her. So that would have been like a moment that Shay could have stepped through a different door. I think one of the main, I think that Shay's character development is very much driven by the thing that like Aitmata sort of rejects, which is her family, right? And the Ait is such a go it alone person, and it becomes incredibly influential and powerful because of just being kind of the strong woman, right? And Shay leans much more on her family. But yeah, there's a lot of parallels between them, which is why they keep meeting and debating each other over and over again.
Yeah.
I love those moments too.
I also just fully appreciate how often Shay gets to make mistakes in these series. Like she does flounder in moments, and she does, like, even towards the end, like there's the moment where she's like, I really messed up. I missed something huge. And I just think that like that's very unique for a character like Shay, who's like a POV like woman in a fantasy novel where usually they're like stoic and perfect. And even like Shay and a lot of her romantic relationships, like she makes mistakes. There are a million different paths you could have had her go down. And even she seems to understand, like, oh yeah, I could have been a fully different person if I went down a different path. And so like when you were developing her, how did you figure out like where she was going to end up?
I think she might have been one of the characters I had the least clear idea of her path and where she would end when I started writing the series. I got a much clearer idea for Hilo and for Andin, and for Lon and some of the other characters. Even Ait, I knew from a very early stage what Ait's trajectory would be. But Shay, yeah, she's one of those characters who, she has had very indecisive periods in her life, and she has doubts and she has regrets, and there's times where she makes mistakes. She has to live with them. So for Shay, it was really just about like trying to get to know her better throughout the course of the series, but also understanding that like she has like her principles that she holds dear, and that she's going to she's this constant in a way like caught in the middle sort of character, in that she rejected the clan, went away, had a foreign education. She has ideas of how she would like to, of what she dislikes about the clan, how she would want to modernize it, how it should be different. But she's also a very powerful figure in what is a very traditional society, a male-dominated society. She's family responsibilities as well. So she's constantly like walking this tightrope of these conflicting desires and priorities, even like her personal life versus clan, her position as a clan leader. So for Shay, it was all very often like walking this tightrope, and I realized like kind of in the process of writing it that like she's going to accomplish the things that she wants to accomplish, but it's going to be at this great cost, and that's it is like the way the clan changes over the course of the 30 odd years is really a victory for Shay. But it's such a gradual incremental victory that's very hard fought and hard won.
Yeah.
And she can never quite escape the egregious event of dating a man named Gerald.
Right.
Which seems to haunt her forever. And I can't tell you how many times I laughed that it was just mentioned, like, what about Gerald? Like, move on from him.
Imagine throwing your life away for a man named Gerald.
Oh, that was so funny.
Not her brightest moment.
No. We've all been there. We've all dated a Gerald.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So getting into like more of the characters that you would see like parallels with, or like compare and contrast them, I think one of the most obvious comparisons would be to compare Hilo with Lan, and they're really just kind of foils of one another in terms of like their personalities and how they lead the clan. Why did you want to show how they were both effective in terms of their leadership of No Peak?
Yeah. No, I think part of this comes also from my business background and having worked in corporate settings for many years, which is this acknowledgement that there are different effective leadership styles. Oftentimes in fiction, we sort of see a very one-dimensional and simple leadership style, and it's often like the Captain America, right, or like Optimus Prime, or like the very upstanding, high integrity, like upright, like Boy Scout kind of leader. And, and oftentimes they're badasses, right? They can fight and they can inspire people with speeches and stuff like that. But there are, and I've done many management training classes in my day on like organizational leadership and leaning into, your particular communication style and how you can influence people, because people are not all the same, right? There's not like one mold for a leader. I've had managers who are very quiet, soft-spoken, but super effective. I've also had managers that are extremely extroverted, very bubbly, very people person. I've had, the manager who just like cussed every second word, and he was effective too. And there's managers who, you can only get them, at certain times. And so like, I've had a wide variety of, and I'm sure many people have. And I wanted to just kind of show that, in this big organization, which would have been, the Greenbone clan, that there's also different personalities, and they influence the way the clan evolves. But there's sometimes it's like the right person at the right time. So like Lon, I feel bad for what I did. I mean, but Lon,
apology one. We're noting it.
But yeah, like Lon would have been a fantastic leader at different time or under different circumstances, or if things had gone a little bit different, and he was a great leader, but misfortune. And like and Hilo is a very good leader in a certain way. But then he has to step into a much bigger role, and he has to evolve as a leader. He has to change, and he and Shay have all these arguments about it along the way too, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to depict, was just the way a big organization would work, and how they would be different types of personalities, different leadership styles, and how they could evolve too.
Well, that's kind of like Ait's final failing, is the fact that they've progressed so far beyond like clan wars. And like you have Shay sitting there being like, our companies have outgrown this, and Ait can't let go of that. So it's interesting to see, the power dynamics at play as well. So we actually did have a listener question though about Lon, and what you think might have happened if he had actually survived the shooting, and like what the outcome would have been, and if you ever had any ideas like that, because it sounds like Lon was pretty much dead from book one beginning. But if you ever had any ideas about his survival.
Oh gosh, that's a really interesting like what if.
Yeah.
One that I never really went far down in considering, because I sort of knew early on. But I think what might have happened is very likely what I think Wen predicted, because Wen's pretty savvy. She kind of knows what's up. But she had predicted that the mountain would take out Hilo, and that with Hilo out of the picture, Lon would be forced to negotiate some sort of peace with the mountain that would be disadvantageous to no peak in the long run, and allow the mountain to gradually become bigger and bigger, more powerful. So I think if Lon had survived, that might well have been the case, was that the mountain would have taken another run at Hilo at some point.
So the mountain was right that Hilo was the person to take out, and then like Nopi couldn't have survived his loss. So that's fascinating.
I mean, they would have survived, but it would have been a very different, under different.
Right. Yeah, the whole dynamic would have changed, because Lon was so much more open to peace between the clans.
Yeah.
I think that Nico is a really interesting version of Lon that we get later on in the series. And he really becomes, the way that he becomes Pillar is so interesting, because he's building off of what he's learning from Hilo and Shay in a way that Hilo didn't get that kind of help and support. And so it's really nice to see him step into this. But at the same time, Nico's really kind of coming at this from the standpoint of like, I don't think I'm the best person to do this, but I'm not the worst. And I think that there could be a lot worse people than me stepping into this. Why did you want to end up with the Pillar being this kind of like approach to it? Because you could have chosen another character, like Shay could have been the Pillar, and she could have been like, yes, or whoever could have stepped into the role as Pillar. But I thought it was really interesting that Nico was the one, and that he was kind of taking this stance.
Yeah. Part of it was the resonance of kind of how the of it coming full circle. The other part of it was the fact that Nico would have grown up in a very different environment than Hilo or Shay. And, he would have been, he born into a time of clan war. So he would have seen like all the pain and destruction that all these years of clan warfare would have caused. And also he had this really formative part of his story, which is basically like he's an orphan, right? Like his biological mother and father both being dead. So I also thought, I had talked earlier about how I wanted each of the 3 installments to feel like their own thing and to have the scaffold that expanded on the first book. And I've also thought of each of the 3 books in terms of their relation to the theme of power. So the first book, Jade City, is really about this generation of characters coming into power, and Jade War is about them hanging on to that power. And then the third book is about them passing that power on to the next generation.
I love that.
That's also really fascinating, because I think that there's like a lot of generational learning that we see. Like we have the torch of Keikon, and like kind of he was raised during, or he was like in power during like occupation and like the after effects of that. And then you have this lost generation of people who are lost at war. And then you have a generation of like infighting of like what was left in all the different power dynamics. And then you have this group of people who come after the infighting and after the power. And like, did you study like war dynamics and different generational stuff, or was that just like something that seemed to come naturally? Because I found that very like resonant when I was reading through all the different generations.
Yeah, I didn't do any specific research, but I was definitely inspired by just real history of 20th century in our world, especially like the post-World War II generation, which is my parents' generation. And, my parents, my father's family left, occupied China and fled to Taiwan. And then eventually like my mom and dad like immigrated to North America. And so like there was a lot of upheaval in their generation, right? And like a massive amount of modernization that happened during that time, migration, just so much going on. And so I had sort of a instinctual sense and desire for wanting to reflect that in the story as well. Like I just know like my outlook on the world and like my generation, especially as like second generation Asian American, is like very different from theirs, right? And so that's kind of what I wanted to just be or authentically part of the story as well, was just like the disconnect that the generations have from each other because of just the time of history that they lived through.
And you also depict like the immigrant experience really beautifully in this series as well, because we see Andon traveling to different countries and how he interacts with different groups and how there are so many different complicated things that he has to overcome and think about. So it's really a fascinating way to include all these things that are real life situations into your book. So kudos to you on that.
Thank you.
I want to double back on Hilo because I will not let it go with him. The loyalty that Hilo has to his friends and family, it has like no bounds. We know he's super personable and everything. And he becomes friends with the Mike family. Is it pronounced Mike?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've heard it pronounced differently. I think in the audiobook it's the Mike family, but I've also said the Make family.
Okay. But they become some of his greatest friends and then family. And it's devastating the way that all of their stories kind of end, because those brothers, Ken and Tar, they put so much loyalty into their work and so much love towards Hilo into their work. And I was kind of wondering how you feel about his relationship with the family in general, and if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the plotting or how hard it was to plot this out with that family, and especially Tar, because that was such a devastating ending.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, Ken and Tar initially started out as basically like, a main protagonist's like two buddies, right? Like they started out as like, the sidekicks, the henchmen,
the lackeys.
Yeah. And I just kept like, I just grew very fond of them, honestly, because they were so, that sort of brotherhood that Hilo and Ken and Tar have, such a like big part of the books, that I couldn't help but like bring that family to life, especially since like he's dating Wen, and they basically they are one big family, and like the Make family is like so. I mean, they're both like a Cinderella story and a cautionary tale, because they buy so fully into the clan and into being part of like Hilo's rise to power, that they gain enormously from it. And they basically rise from being like very low in the family or very low in the clan, to being like one of the top families in the No Peak clan. But that also is like the seeds of their destruction, right? So yeah, they were interesting characters to write.
You have so many interesting characters, because a lot of the times I feel like they start off as not like as an intentional, but like you think they're going to be a specific type of trope, and then there's like an inversion of them. So you have like Andon, who's the reluctant hero, like he's so powerful, and then he just kind of steps away for a while, and then he comes back into his own power in a very unique way. And then you have Shay, who's like the prodigal son returning, but like she still kind of keeps her own, and then she comes back and she's like, no, I learned a lot from my time away, so I'm going to make this a new role, and I'm not going to just be like coming back with my tail between my legs. And then you have like Barrow, who is supposed to be this downtrodden everyman who like wants to build himself up, but he's also just a fully self-serving character, and it like is often his downfall. So like, were you kind of aiming to make these tropes and then deconstruct them, or is it always just it's like getting back to your fully formed realized people, or what was it like kind of building these different types of dynamics?
Sometimes it was deliberate, and many other times it was not. It just sort of happened. Some of the one time that it definitely was deliberate was with Wen. So Wen, I definitely initially wanted to have her appear as like the stereotypical mob girlfriend, right? She's probably going to get fridged, that character who's like just a motivation for the main POV character. I've watched plenty of mafia movies, so I know that type of character, and I very deliberately wanted to set that up to knock it down. But some of the other characters, you're right, they just kind of started as broad strokes archetypes, and then they became more as I sort of chipped away at them and worked them into the narrative.
I like how you address the Stone Eyes in the story, because they are like very important and relevant to things that happen. And Rue becomes really important actually in shaping Hilo and the things that happen in the No Peak clan going forward. And it's like really beautiful that he's able to make an impact on the clan. And you kind of mentioned this before, but I guess I'll just double down on it. Do you think that Hilo's legacy is his children and how he was shaped by them?
That's a good question. I think that definitely is part of his legacy, but I think his broader legacy is he thinks of the whole clan as his family, right? As the clan is sort of the extension for him of his like immediate family. So it's very hard for him to draw any boundaries. And the way that he raised his children is very much tied to his views about the role of being a green bone warrior and what that means. And that has good aspects and destructive aspects. And so that is ultimately, his legacy is kind of like he did everything to protect his family, and by extension, his clan, including doing things that, he was uncomfortable with, stepping into a role that he never really intended to have, and, kind of doing the best that he could given the circumstances. So yeah, like I think he is that character who sort of like we had talked earlier about like the archetypes, right? Like Hilo, when he shows up on the page, is very much like the archetypical like badass warrior guy, right? He's the muscle, right?
Yeah.
He's like, he's the muscle, he's the enforcer. And I thought it would be super fun to like take that character and turn him into the one who has to like lead this big organization. And he's not, and
he becomes the underdog.
Right. Yeah. He is sort of steps into that role with a great deal of skepticism from people around him. And so for him to succeed is like, it's a really big long-term feat.
But also, like, you just do so well at like giving him a leg up because he's a self-actualized muscle man who like walked into the role and he's like, I did not want to be here. Like, I really didn't want this particular job. No, thank you.
Right.
Like,
this is a terrible job. Very stressful. Yes.
Kind of happy where I was.
Yeah, it's the community joke, the TV show where Troy's like, I never wanted to meet the person, I just wanted an autograph. So I did want to ask, because Laura and I have been making a joke, so this is a little bit of a lighter question to throw at you, but we made so many jokes about Andon and Lot. Like, we just started calling Lot like Andon's boyfriend, and so like was it just one of those things where you're like,
crumbs?
Yeah, where we were like, oh, they're totally gonna be boyfriends by the end of this, so like just call him Andon's boyfriend, it's fine. And like, was it one of those things where you built it up and then you were like, nope, I can't do that, I'm gonna just pull the rug out from under you guys, he's not gonna end up with this man?
I didn't intentionally do it. I did it more because Lot and Andon are like narrative mirrors to each other, right? Like Lot basically takes the position that Andon would have had if he hadn't rejected Jade and run off, right? So they just kept intersecting because I loved to kind of to see them together because they were like each other's mirrors, right? Like Andon goes and does the thing away from the clan that Lot like seems like he wants to do in Jade City. So they keep crossing paths, and I loved the drawing them together in that way. But as a result, I also never saw them together. Like me personally, I never saw them ending up together at the end because their paths diverge. Like their whole point of their narrative path was that they went in opposite directions. But yes, there's enough breadcrumbs there that I knew that some readers, that readers would ship. And I was fine with that. I was like, that's cool. I'm happy with that ship. It's not, even if I don't end up writing it, I'm happy that it's out there.
We did prefer Andon's other ending. Like, I preferred him getting with someone who wasn't part of the clan. I thought that was a perfect ending, but it was just, we were like, oh no, he's boyfriend, it's fine. So yeah, that was very much, and like exactly to Andon, to your point, like Andon's path was at the end that he would be like, if he was with Lot, he would be sucked in like deep into the clan, so that wasn't in my mind the right ending for him. But I respect the shippers for sure.
Can we talk about the ending that you give to some of the bigger villains in the story? Mata, and I think he's a villain, Barrow. Because I find them so interesting, because basically what happens to them is they become their biggest worry. They're irrelevant. And why was this the decision that you made with these characters and their ending?
I just feel like it was right for Mata, that like she would try to hang on to power for way longer than the country actually needed or wanted her to. And that just seems like so typical of other people in our world, right? Like who amass a lot of power, and then they're like, I don't want to give it up. And in a way, it's also reminiscent of that previous generation, like Khal San, and how he wasn't willing to give up his power in the family. So I just didn't see a like big, glorious, satisfying final death for either Ide or for Barrow. And Barrow, was that there were many times I considered killing him.
I wish. I wanted it so many times.
I think that's what we want the biggest apology for. That he wound up at like
Why
the last.
Is he still here?
I did consider it. And like, reader pressure was there. Like even after the first book, there was considerable amount of reader pressure. But he's just like I just grew to enjoy him too much, I guess. Like I just really found him to be such a like breath of narrative fresh air whenever he showed up. And he was a tool that was so useful for me to connect different parts of the narrative whenever there wasn't like a immediate call family member there, right? Like that he gave us such a like different view of that society, and he got into so many other scrapes and troubles and stuff that he just was super useful to me. And I just think that Barrow's biggest punishment is that he spent the whole length of this story trying to make something out of himself, right? Like that's what he's trying to do for 3 whole books. Is he's constantly like on the man, like I like he constantly is striving, and in a way that's like admirable about him, but that's his biggest punishment. Like his punishment isn't that I know people want him to die, but I think that's a greater punishment for him.
Well, it's so interesting because, like, you're right. He's just striving to be somebody, but he's someone who wasn't born into inherent power. So it's like the perfect showing of what it means to be powerless in like a society that has like that kind of system where you're not supposed to be in power, and you might have it for a moment, but if you don't have structural support, what will you do when you lose it? So it's really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, in a different narrative, he could have been a great protagonist, right? Like the underdog who's trying to wrench power away from those that have it, but that just wasn't his fate in these books.
That was Laura. Every time she brought it up, she's like, I just want him to die. And I'm like, but the thing is like he's such a good, like he would have been a main character in any other novel, but here he's just the worst. So.
I understood like why he was there, because I was like, this is kind of the character where like, follow me along with this story. But every time I would get into his point of view, I'd be so frustrated, like, oh, why are you still here?
I also just loved how, like, again, you just have the most self-aware characters where Barrow's like, I should probably be dead. I'm just lucky. It's so nice to have him say what we're all thinking. So we have another listener question, which is, do you feel that there is any area of the world that you think is ripe for exploration that falls outside of what we saw in the books, or like something you would enjoy like writing more about?
Oh gosh, I can think of a few. I mean, I think that like I got a little bit of that when I wrote the Jade Setter of Janloon, which is the spin-off prequel novella, because I got to play with a different cast of characters and still have cameos of the main characters come in and play with like a detective or a crime noir sort of story in a smaller format. But in terms of like other parts of the world, I mean, I would have been happy to do like I could imagine an entire story sort of set in like the Kekanese community in Hispania. And Ron Toro in his early days, and like everything that went on in Port Massey. Another era that would have been fun to explore was the Many Nations War, and like Khal Sen and Aiyu as young men during like the resistance fighting and all that.
That would be awesome. Great. And if you ever wanted to give it to us, we would say yes.
We would not say no to those. My last question is, I'm sure you've heard a ton of fans calling for a TV adaptation of the series. So I'm wondering if you've thought of any actors that you'd like to see portraying some of your characters in the Greenbone saga.
Well, I have had enough fan casts that have crossed my view that like now I have like multiple options, and I don't feel like I have like strong opinions, but there's a few. I mean, I think Daniel Henney as Lon would be great, because then he can play Lon twice. He's Lon.
Wheel of Time Lon.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like that could be like a whole career path for him, which is like playing characters named Lon.
He has it in his rider, like, you must change the name. It must be Lon. That's awesome.
I think that he would be great also. I watch a lot of Star Wars, so I was imagining Aitmata as Ming-Na Wen, and that was someone that I'm just like, oh, she would be so perfect in that role.
Yes, yeah. I think it was like for Aitmata, it really kind of comes down to like Michelle Yeoh or Ming Na
Oh
Wen.
yeah.
Yeah. But
That would be great too.
I don't know. There's something about like Michelle Yeoh popping up as like the Call's mom that like kind of like if she like if things like age a little bit and progress, where it's like a very standard like sharp dynamic actress like playing with that role a little bit about like how were they raised and by who. I think like that would be interesting, where you have like these very mainstay actors and actresses playing like roles that you wouldn't expect them, because I feel like that would be fun for you. Like if we had like Jackie Chan like aged up and playing the Torch of K-Khan, and it's like, oh my gosh, she's awful. Like,
I'd be down for that.
Yeah.
Or Fonda like on the set like screaming, so excited, martial arts hero.
Yeah. But I think that'd just be fascinating.
I mean, Jackie Chan, in any role, any cameo,
anything he wants to do.
Yeah.
But I just think it would be fun to see characters do that. So, like, because your books are so much about like inverting expectations or seeing like characters in different ways. So I think playing around with the casting would be so cool. But yeah, I think that we're kind of coming to an end. So, could you tell all the listeners what you're reading, watching, and or enjoying right now?
Gosh, right now I'm crazy busy working on book manuscripts, so I have very little time to read and watch television. But what I'm enjoying right now, making my way through slowly, is the television show Uncanny Counter. It is like it's a Korean drama that's on Netflix, and it's basically like superheroes who run a noodle shop and fight demons.
Oh, I love that.
That's amazing.
That's like cozy fantasy for TV. Like,
so that, and then I am going to a convention in Ottawa in October called CanCon, and I'm on a panel about Full Metal Alchemist, which is my favorite anime. So cool. I guess I'm just gonna have to, I don't know, rewatch and reread the entire thing.
Laura has been going into like a ton of different anime and manga, so she's in that era of her life, so she'll definitely have to watch out for that. So
kind of in my Attack on Titan, which had Atelier phase.
But can you tell everyone where to find you outside of that panel?
Yeah, I can be found online, fondalee.com. I am also on Instagram at fonda.lee. I'm still on that cursed bird app at Fonda J. Lee.
Well, we want to thank you so much for writing this series, because this is like, I think it's my favorite trilogy and series of all time, pretty much now. I just think it's so unique and so special. So we just really appreciate all your work. Like we said, like it really shines through your discussion on how you may not have been able to read it 5 to 10 years ago. We're like reading this as adults. It just feels so mature and ready and like perfect in its own setting. So thank you so much for writing it.
Yes.
Thank you
Everyone
so much.
Go follow Fonda wherever you can. Fonda is definitely hardest worker in the room all the time and puts so much heart and work into these stories, and they're just beautiful. So please read them and find her work and find her online.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. So everyone,
thank you for covering my books.
And go buy all of those books and all of those little sequels that she's just going to give us of Port Massey and everything else. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.